Welcome to Hopetales, where a quiet girl with an extraordinary gift proved that heroes don't always speak. Sometimes they're the ones who listen. The aircraft lifted from the runway with a smooth rise, its wings cutting through the dense evening air like a silent arrow. Below, the city's glowing lights faded into a scattered web, leaving the world beneath shrinking into darkness. As the plane climbed higher, the cabin filled with the familiar hum that most passengers never paid attention to. A steady vibration that blended into the background of the human mind. But for Amara, that vibration was its own universe. She sat quietly near the middle of the cabin, her small notebook resting on her lap. She was used to going unnoticed. Her delicate posture, soft eyes, and silent demeanor made her blend into any environment. Her teachers used to call her invisible. Classmates called her strange, but she didn't mind. She lived in a world of patterns, frequencies, hidden meanings that others didn't even know existed. She understood sound in a way that no one around her ever had. As the plane leveled into its cruise altitude, she pressed her fingertips softly against the armrest. Most people would feel nothing, just the slight trembling that came with flight, but her senses were tuned to micro-vibrations. She felt a faint, uneven pulse under the smooth drone of the engines, a small irregularity almost impossible to notice. Yet it tugged at her attention instantly. She closed her eyes, letting the vibrations run through her pores like a coded message. Her breathing slowed. Her mind filtered out layers of sound, engine rotation, airflow, cabin pressure systems, until the anomaly remained alone. A pulse, a beat, a rhythm that didn't belong. Amara opened her worn notebook, filled with numbers, signals, and sequences she had studied for years. She scribbled a simple pattern. 0, 3, 1, 3, 1, 2. These numbers weren't random. They represented time intervals she felt between pulses, intervals so subtle no sensor or human ear would detect. But she felt them deep in her bones. The passengers around her were lost in their own worlds. Phones, food, sleep, conversations. A little girl played with a stuffed bear. An old couple quietly held hands. A businessman typed furiously on his laptop. Life was happening normally, peacefully. But the metal under their feet was whispering a different story. Amara leaned slightly closer to the wall of the cabin. The irregularity grew clearer. She felt an almost inaudible tapping echo through the structure. It wasn't noise, it was communication. Her heart rate quickened. She had learned these patterns from countless hours listening to Black. Box recordings, decoding pre-failure signals, understanding the subtle frequencies aircraft produced when something deep inside their systems was failing. She knew how every healthy system should sound, and how a stressed one whispered before disaster. This one wasn't healthy. Another tremor brushed against the cabin floor, so light that no one else reacted. But for her, it was as distinct as a shout, a soft metallic shift, like a stressed component adjusting itself against rising tension. She wrote another code. 7, 3, 7, delta shift. The pitch of the vibration had changed. She looked toward the aisle as a flight attendant walked past with a practiced smile. Everything appeared normal. Nothing in the cabin hinted at danger. But her instincts screamed a different truth. She placed her palm flat on the cabin wall again, letting every vibration pass through her skin. A new sound emerged, a small click. Then another. Then a longer, dragging pulse. Her breath caught. This was the pattern only certain. Tail section components, produced under electrical stress, stabilizer systems, pitch control mechanisms, systems that were essential to the aircraft's balance. Her chest tightened. She wasn't imagining it. Something was trying to tell her, something buried deep inside the aircraft's frame. A soft shudder passed through the floor. Passengers barely noticed. Some thought it was turbulence, but Amara knew that turbulence didn't come from the tail vibrating in a stressed, rhythmic pattern. The girl swallowed hard. She had lived her entire life in silence, never able to speak her thoughts, never able to explain the things she could. Hear that others couldn't. People only saw a quiet, strange girl. No one ever listened. But right now, if no one listened, 240 people might not see the ground again. She took a deep breath and forced herself to think clearly. She marked the vibration intervals with timestamps. Each interval showed decay, meaning the fault was escalating slowly. The tapping grew sharper, more pronounced. The click sequence formed a repeating pattern. Tap, pause, tap, tap, Long tap. Her stomach knotted. It was a coded structure used in rare emergency error strings. Something inside the stabilizer assembly was approaching failure, but the main flight computer hadn't detected it yet. If it reached the critical point before detection, the pilots would lose partial pitch control without warning. The plane would begin a slow, almost invisible downward drift. Pilots might think it was just wind, just turbulence. By the time they realized the truth, too much altitude would be gone. She tightened her grip on her notebook. Passengers continued laughing, sleeping, scrolling. Life around her remained beautifully unaware. It felt surreal that she alone could sense danger creeping through the aircraft, like a quiet shadow. Her heartbeat synchronized with the irregular pulses. Her palms grew warm. She lifted her eyes slowly toward the aisle. She had never spoken up before, never intervened, never stepped forward. But silence wasn't an option now. The tapping rose once more, sharper, angrier, faster. A warning. She snapped her notebook shut. For the first time in her life, the quiet girl prepared to stand, because the plane wasn't safe, and she was the only one who knew. The plane sliced through a sea of quiet clouds, its engines steady, its lights blinking softly against the vast darkness. To most passengers, the flight felt smooth and uneventful, a peaceful journey through calm skies. But to Amara, the silence had weight. The vibrations held tension, and every second carried a hidden message she could no longer ignore. She remained frozen for a moment, notebook in hand, feeling the small pulses beneath her feet. They were no longer random. They had sharpened into a structured pattern, the kind that never appeared unless a system had begun to deteriorate. A subtle change in frequency signaled that the fault was evolving, slowly moving from harmless irregularity toward a dangerous threshold. She closed her eyes, letting the vibrations run through her like electricity. They entered her fingertips, traveled up her arm, and settled deep behind her ribs where fear and instinct lived. Her pulse matched the aircraft's mechanical stutter. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Around her, the cabin was a world of normalcy. Someone laughed softly a few rows behind. Drinks clinked faintly. Pages turned as a woman read her book. Cabin lights shimmered against the overhead bins, painting everything in a warm, peaceful glow. Nothing looked wrong. Nothing sounded wrong, unless you were the girl who listened differently. Amara leaned forward slightly, focusing again. The engine hum remained stable, but what concerned her lay beyond the engines, farther back, near the tail. The stabilizer systems carried vibrations that should have been smooth, continuous. Instead, she sensed intermittent bursts, like a strained breath, like a heartbeat skipping its rhythm. The tapping she heard earlier returned, this time with an added layer, a faint oscillation beneath it, a tremor she recognized from one of the black box studies she had obsessed over for years. It was the early signature of a potential motor imbalance inside the tail's elevator control unit. She wrote again. Interval drop, 0.4 sec. Resonance change, plus 2.6 hertz. Pattern shift, unstable. Her handwriting shook slightly. The fault was growing. She took a slow, deep breath. She knew what came next. If the stabilizer motor weakened further, it would begin losing torque. Once torque weakened, the tail would produce uneven pitch correction. The plane wouldn't dive suddenly. It wouldn't jerk violently. No dramatic chaos. Instead, pitch loss would come quietly, almost invisible, a gradual deadly tilt. And by the time sensors picked up the error, the window for reaction would be dangerously small. She lifted her eyes and scanned the cabin. The world around her remained untouched by worry. A child slept against his mother with peaceful breaths. A man watched a movie with headphones on, smiling faintly at the screen. A flight attendant poured juice for an elderly couple. Every life around her moved with the comfort of a normal flight. Amara's chest tightened. How? Could danger move so quietly through a place so calm? She gently placed her hand against the cabin wall again, near the window. The vibration there was clearer, purer. Metal transmitted sound differently when stressed. And now she sensed a thin, wavering tone running beneath the primary. A high-frequency resonance like a wire under tension. Her stomach dropped. That tone meant heat buildup. And heat meant escalation. She leaned closer, turning her head slightly so her ear almost brushed the wall. The tapping had changed again. No longer steady. Now sporadic, erratic, desperate. Systems never tapped desperately unless something was wrong. Her notebook snapped open once more. She drew a new pattern, a jagged line representing instability. Then she paused. Her fingers trembled. For a moment, fear whispered inside her mind. The old fear, the one that had kept her silent her whole life. She had always been the girl people ignored, the one whose strange habits and unusual understanding of sound made her an outsider. She had never spoken up, never inserted herself into anything important. But this wasn't a classroom. This wasn't a quiet corner of her home. This was a metal tube flying at 35,000 feet with hundreds of people who trusted the machine carrying them, and the machine was calling to her. She turned slightly in her seat, glancing down the aisle. She could see the faint shadow of the tail through the cabin windows, a massive structure that held the balance of the aircraft, beautiful, powerful, vulnerable. She needed to move closer. She needed to confirm what she felt. And more importantly, she needed to warn someone. Her heartbeat thudded softly in her chest as she stood. The aisle wavered before her for a moment. She steadied herself against the seat in front of her and took a slow breath. The tapping grew sharper as she walked toward the rear of the plane. Each step brought her closer to the source of the sound only she could hear. A flight attendant passed her with a polite nod, unaware of the silent storm building in the metal behind them. As she reached the midsection, another soft tremor rolled through the cabin floor, subtle, delicate but unnatural. Passengers barely reacted, but her senses flared instantly. She pressed her palm to the wall. The oscillation had increased. Her breath hitched. Then came another sign, an almost imperceptible drop in ambient noise frequency. Not loud, not clear, but enough. It meant an internal component had shifted position, likely due to increasing load. She wrote more notes, her hand moving quickly. Component shift. Possible bracket tension loss. Temperature rise, 3-4 degrees. Vibration amplitude, x 1.7. She didn't need more data. She already knew the truth. The stabilizer motor was entering the early stages of failure. If it progressed, the pilots would face a nightmare scenario, a sudden struggle for pitch control in midair. Amara reached the back of the cabin, where the air felt different. Slightly warmer, slightly more pressurized. These changes were almost unnoticeable to normal passengers. But to her, they were the signs of a system under stress. She placed both hands gently on the wall. The tapping there was rapid, shallow, distorted, not rhythmic anymore. It was the same pattern black boxes emitted when recording structural anomalies during high-altitude flight. Her pulse raced. She exhaled slowly, gathering courage. She had to intervene. She had to warn the crew. She had to make them understand. Even if she couldn't explain the way other people did, even if no one believed a quiet girl with a notebook filled with strange codes. The plane vibrated once more, slightly stronger this time. Passengers shifted in their seats, confused by the brief tremble, but no panic followed. No alarms rang. Only Amara knew that the silent clock had already started ticking. She clenched her notebook, feeling her heartbeat pound through the paper. This was no longer about fear. It was about survival. She moved toward the flight attendant station, ready to do something she had spent her whole life avoiding. She would break her silence. The back of the aircraft felt different, heavier, warmer, tense. As Amara stood near the flight attendant station, she sensed the silent chaos unfolding beneath the metal skin of the plane. The world around her still looked normal, soft cabin lights glowing like stars, passengers moving lazily in their seats, the gentle hum of engines maintaining their quiet rhythm. But beneath that peaceful layer, the aircraft whispered warnings in pulses and frequencies only she could hear. The vibrations had grown sharper now, almost restless. She pressed her fingertips against the narrow wall near the equipment panel. The metal felt warm, too warm. The resonance here was no longer subtle. It carried urgency. It carried strain. It carried the unmistakable signature of mechanical distress. A new sequence emerged. Short pulse. Quick double tap. Pause. Long pulse. Her breath caught. This was no longer a simple anomaly. This was a progressive fault entering a dangerous stage. The elevator control motor wasn't just struggling, it was fighting to stay alive. She opened her notebook quickly, scribbling numbers with shaking fingers. Amplitude spike, x 2.4. Thermal rise, pas 6 degrees. Pattern integrity collapsing. Her chest tightened. The system was degrading much faster now. Amara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the vibrations travel through her spine. She sensed the frequency drop in the stabilizer, the same pattern she had heard in disaster recordings she had spent years studying. It brought back memories she wished would fade. She remembered nights spent listening to black box audio, tracing every sound, mapping every frequency, trying to understand how machines cried before breaking. Tonight she wasn't studying a recording. She was living inside one. The plane trembled faintly. Not turbulence. She knew turbulence by heart. This shiver came from metal shifting under uneven torque. A passenger turned his head, confused but not alarmed. A baby whimpered softly. The cabin returned to normal as quickly as the tremor came. But the vibrations didn't disappear for her. They intensified. She stepped closer to the rear bulkhead, her heart thudding against her ribs. She placed her ear gently against the wall. At first she heard the leftover hum of the engines. Then slowly the tapping emerged. A rapid, irregular beat like a frantic code. It was broken, fragmented. It had lost the structure it once had. That meant one thing. The system was nearing a breaking threshold. She imagined the stabilizer motor deep inside the tail, its coils overheated, its bearings worn, its torque faltering, its rotation becoming uneven. Every shift of metal translated into a sound, and every sound became a message. And the message was clear. The plane was losing its balance. Not dramatically, not suddenly, quietly. She straightened, gripping her notebook tightly. She felt a chill run down her arms despite the warm air. A subtle tilt brushed through the cabin, so gentle that no one noticed. But she felt it instantly. The nose dipped by a fraction of a degree, barely measurable. But in aviation, fractions mattered. She inhaled sharply. She needed to warn the crew, now. She stepped toward the attendant station, where 2 crew members stood sorting drink trays. They didn't sense danger. Their movements were relaxed, their faces calm, unaware of the silent threat behind them. Amara hesitated. Fear gripped her throat, not fear of the plane, but fear of speaking, fear of being dismissed, fear of being seen as strange. She had spent her whole life hiding behind silence. But her silence wasn't just a habit. It was armor. And right now, that armor felt heavy. She took a slow step forward and tapped the counter softly. The attendants looked at her with polite curiosity. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Her mouth moved without sound. The words refused to form. The pressure of being noticed froze her mind. Her breath quickened. She looked down, her fingers tightening around her notebook. She flipped it open and pointed to her coded patterns, her shaking hand tracing the lines that represented the failing system. The attendants frowned, confused. They didn't understand her symbols, her numbers, her language. She tried again to speak, but her voice died in her throat. A wave of helplessness washed over her. And then something changed. The plane shuddered again, sharper this time. The overhead lights flickered faintly. Passengers murmured. Heads lifted. The cabin grew still for a moment. That tremor wasn't subtle anymore, not even for ordinary ears. The attendants' eyes widened. They felt it too. Amara saw their expressions shift from confusion to concern. She tapped the rear wall urgently, pressing her ear against it as the tapping inside the metal rose to a frantic pace. The attendants exchanged worried glances. One of them quietly reached for the interphone while the other moved toward her. Amara pointed again at her notebook, at the jagged lines showing instability, at the intervals collapsing, at the pattern signaling imminent mechanical failure. She didn't need to speak. The urgency in her trembling hands, the fear in her eyes, the rapid trembling of the wall behind her said enough. The interphone beeped softly. A call to the cockpit. Amara closed her eyes in fragile relief, but the danger hadn't stopped. It was growing. She leaned her body against the panel again, pressing firmly. The tapping had turned into a strange, grinding vibration, a mechanical groan, deep and low like metal-resisting force. Her stomach twisted. That groan meant torque loss had begun. The elevator system was losing strength. A loss of pitch control was no longer a possibility. It was beginning. For a moment, she closed her eyes and exhaled shakily. She didn't want to be right. She didn't want to feel this. She didn't want the weight of knowing. But she did know. and she knew what was coming next. The cockpit door would open. The crew would need answers, and she would have to give them something she had never given anyone. Her voice. She opened her eyes. The tapping inside the wall stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was worse than any sound she had ever heard. Because silence meant the motor had reached its critical point, Amara lifted her trembling hands. It was time. She had to save them. The aircraft made another subtle dip. This time, several passengers reacted. Someone looked out the window nervously. Another pressed the call button. The businessman closed his laptop slowly, sensing something was wrong. But Amara felt more than wrong. She felt the system unraveling. The vibrations inside the wall were chaotic now. No rhythm, no structure, just violent distortion. It was the same sound she had once heard in a black box recording moments before failure. Her hands shook. Her chest tightened. Her pulse throbbed painfully in her temples. The plane's heartbeat was failing, and she was standing right next to the artery. The emergency alarms fell silent, leaving behind only the trembling hum of the struggling aircraft. Darkness pressed against the windows where lightning had danced moments earlier. But now, inside the cockpit, a different kind of storm had settled. One built not of clouds, but of fear, exhaustion, and the final thin thread of hope tied to a quiet girl who had never been noticed until tonight. Amara stood near the threshold of the cockpit. Her small notebook still clutched tightly in her hand. Her fingers trembled, but her eyes stayed steady. She could feel everything, the vibration of the weakening stabilizer, the uneven breathing of the pilots, the fading rhythm of the aircraft trying desperately to hold itself together. Each sound blended into a single fragile melody, the kind she knew all too well. The aircraft descended slowly, caught between survival and surrender. But beneath the shaking metal was still a heartbeat, faint, wounded but alive, and she understood it better than anyone else on board. The first officer, injured and exhausted, tried to stabilize the descent manually. His movements were controlled but heavy, as though every muscle in his body had turned to stone. The plane resisted him, slipping sideways. Amara felt the imbalance ripple through the cabin, floor, and shot forward instinctively, placing her hand on a side panel. There it was. The same pattern as before, but slower now, dragging like a voice running out of breath. She closed her eyes, absorbing its meaning. The secondary system was dangerously close to overheating. If it burned out, the pilots would lose the very last backup that was keeping the aircraft from tipping forward. Her pulse quickened. She flipped open her notebook with her free hand, tracking the intervals again. The sequence was almost rhythmic, fading in and out like a weak signal trying to stay alive. She knew she had only minutes left to interpret and act. Minutes that meant the difference between a broken aircraft and a controlled miracle. Her mind raced through every recording she'd ever listened to. Countless black box archives she had studied in silence. Failures, warnings, patterns. She remembered the ones most people skipped. The rarest events, where the aircraft didn't speak. Through instruments, but through vibrations. Through pulse codes, through structural tremors. And she remembered how only a few of those planes had ever made it back safely. Each of those survivors had one thing in common. Someone understood their signals. She placed her ear closer to the panel, letting the hum travel through her bones. The sound thickened, deepened, then fluttered softly. A new pattern appeared, a long vibration, followed by 3 short ones. She froze. This wasn't a failure code. This was a response. The plane, fighting against physics, was signaling its final route. A narrow window where the stabilizer would briefly align with the airflow, allowing the pilots to regain temporary control. It would only last seconds, but in those seconds, the aircraft could be guided toward a safer angle for landing. Her breath caught as another tremor passed beneath her hand. She could practically visualize the airflow shifting across the tail, the metal flexing, the mechanisms trembling against pressure. She understood the moment. She knew when it would come. She paced forward, heart pounding, then stopped near the pilot's seat. The first officer nodded faintly, sensing her certainty. The captain, barely conscious, leaned back as she gently pointed toward the altitude readout. Then the angle indicator, then the throttle. Her gestures were clear, precise. She wasn't speaking, but her instructions flowed like a language she had been born with. The turbulence grabbed the aircraft again, rocking it violently. Oxygen masks swayed. Luggage clattered inside overhead bins. A child somewhere in the cabin whimpered. But underneath the chaos, she felt the rhythm she was waiting for approach. Slow, steady, unstoppable. The heartbeat of the aircraft began rising, aligning, preparing. She placed her palm flat on the console. There. The pulse changed. This was it. The exact moment. The narrow gap of stability. The first officer reacted instantly, guided by her unwavering focus. The aircraft's nose lifted slightly, fighting gravity. Metal groaned, wind howled past the fuselage, and the stabilizer locked into alignment for only a breath. But in that single breath, everything changed. The descent stabilized. The downward drift slowed. The aircraft began leveling. For the first time since the crisis began, hope flickered across the pilots' faces. Amara felt it too. A warm rush that spread up her spine, making the cockpit seem brighter than it was. She allowed herself a small, rare moment of relief. But it wasn't over yet. The runway lights were now visible in the distance, glowing through shreds of mist. The plane was still descending too fast, still too heavy, still carrying injuries deeper than any sensor could measure. But it was alive, battered but breathing. The final approach began. The landing gear deployed shakily, the vibrations uneven. She felt every jolt, every waver in the structure. The aircraft trembled, but its rhythm was no longer desperate. It was determined. The shadow of the runway grew larger beneath them. The world rose to meet the wounded plane. The hum sharpened. The vibrations steadied. The final landing path aligned. The first officer pulled back gently. The wheels met the runway. Smoke burst from under the wings as the aircraft cried out on impact. For a moment, everything blurred into chaos, the grinding screech of rubber against asphalt, the violent shaking, the burning smell of overheated components. But beneath it all, Amara felt the vibrations soften. The plane slowed. It rolled. It shuddered. And then it stopped. Silence flooded the cabin like warm sunlight. Passengers slowly rose from shock, realizing what had just happened. Tears, relief, trembling breaths filled the air. The captain, now fully awake, stared at the quiet girl who stood not with pride, but with calm acceptance, as though this was simply what she was meant to do. She stepped back, feeling the final gentle tremor under her feet, a soft, grateful pulse. The aircraft was thanking her, its voice fading peacefully. She closed her notebook. A plane full of people was alive because one unnoticed girl could hear what no one else could, and for the first time in her life, her silence had saved the world around her.